It was during my college winter break in 2016 when my friends and I decided to rent a secluded cabin for the weekend. There were 4 of us. My best friend Jake, his girlfriend Emily, my girlfriend Laura, and me. We thought it would be the perfect getaway. A chance to relax, drink, and escape from the stress of finals. Jake had found the cabin on some obscure rental site. It was cheap and far from civilization, tucked away in the snowy wilderness of northern Michigan. When we arrived, the place was everything we'd hoped for. It was surrounded by tall, snow-covered pines, with a frozen lake just visible through the trees. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy, with a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. The only downside was the spotty cell service, but we didn't care. We were here to disconnect. The first night was perfect. We cooked dinner, played board games, and sat around the stove drinking whiskey. The snowstorm outside made the cabin feel even cozier, and we all went to bed that night feeling relaxed and happy. But by the second night, everything changed. The storm had intensified, with snow piling up against the windows and the wind howling through the trees. We were sitting in the living room, playing cards, when Jake suggested we go check out the frozen lake. "It's beautiful at night," he said, pulling on his coat. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. The storm had made the temperature drop even more, and the thought of trudging through knee-deep snow didn't appeal to me. But Laura and Emily were excited, so I went along with it. We grabbed flashlights and headed outside, the snow crunching under our boots. The lake was about a 5-minute walk from the cabin, and by the time we reached it, I was already regretting coming. The wind stung my face, and the cold seemed to seep through my coat. But Jake was right, the lake was beautiful. The snow had stopped briefly, and the moonlight reflected off the ice, making the entire surface glisten. We stood there for a while, taking in the view. Emily pulled out her phone to take a picture, but as she raised it, her expression changed. "Do you guys see that?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. We followed her gaze to the far side of the lake. First, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed it, a dark figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was tall and it wasn't moving. "Probably just a tree or a shadow," Jake said, though his voice sounded less confident than usual. "No, it's not," Emily whispered. "It's watching us." I laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. "Come on, let's head back. It's freezing out here." We turned to leave, but when I glanced back over my shoulder, the figure had moved. It was closer now, standing on the edge of the lake. My stomach dropped. There was no mistaking it, it was a person. We hurried back to the cabin, stumbling through the snow. Jake kept glancing over his shoulder, muttering under his breath. But none of us said a word until we were safely inside with the door locked. "What the hell was that?" Laura asked, her voice shaking. "Probably just someone out for a walk," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. "In this storm," Emily snapped. "At night." We argued for a while, but eventually we convinced ourselves it was nothing to worry about. Maybe it was a local checking the lake or a hunter. But deep down, I didn't believe that. There was something about the way the figure had stood there, watching us, that made my skin crawl. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I stayed up, sitting by the stove and trying to shake the feeling of unease. The wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and making the walls creak. I was just about to head to bed when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was soft at first, barely audible over the wind. I froze, listening as it grew louder. It was coming from the back door. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the door. The tapping stopped. I shone the light through the window, but all I could see was snow. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. Then I noticed the footprints. They started at the edge of the trees and led straight to the door. I stared at them, my mind racing. They were fresh, clear in the snow, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. I locked the door and backed away, my hands shaking. I thought about waking the others, but I didn't want to scare them. Instead, I sat by the stove, clutching the flashlight, and waited for morning. When the sun finally rose, I went outside to check the footprints again, but they were gone. The storm had erased them completely. That afternoon, we decided to cut the trip short. None of us mentioned the figure or the tapping, but I could tell we were all on edge. We packed up quickly, eager to leave, but as we loaded the car, I noticed something. The snow on the roof of the cabin had been disturbed, as if someone, or something, had been up there. I didn't say anything. I just climbed into the car and drove, glancing in the rearview mirror every few minutes. When we finally reached the highway, I felt a wave of relief. But that night, when I got home, I couldn't sleep. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the figure standing at the edge of the lake, its dark silhouette watching me through the snow. It was a couple of years ago during a brutal snowstorm in late December. I was driving home after visiting my parents for the holidays, trying to beat the worst of the weather. The forecast had warned of blizzard conditions, but I thought I could make it if I left early enough. The first few hours were fine, but as the sun began to set, the snow started falling harder, and the road ahead disappeared under a thick, white blanket. I was miles from the nearest town when I spotted him. A lone figure walking along the side of the road. He was wearing a dark coat and a backpack, his head down against the wind. I slowed down as I passed him, unsure if I should stop. Something about him felt off, but the storm was getting worse, and I couldn't leave him out there to freeze. I pulled over and rolled down the passenger window. "Need a ride?" I called out. The man looked up slowly. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes seemed strangely hollow, like he hadn't slept in days. "Thanks," he said, his voice low and raspy. He climbed into the car without another word. As soon as he shut the door, the air inside the car felt colder. I cranked up the heat, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. He was staring straight ahead, his face expressionless. I tried to make small talk, asking where he was headed, but he didn't say much. Just vague answers. Up north, wherever's warm. The longer we drove, the more uneasy I felt. His presence was unsettling, like he didn't quite belong. He kept shifting in his seat, his backpack clutched tightly to his chest. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. About 20 minutes later, the storm got worse. The snow was falling so heavily that I could barely see the road, and the wind was howling like a living thing. I slowed down to a crawl, gripping the wheel tightly. "That's good," the man muttered suddenly. I glanced at him, confused. "What?" "Slower is better," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. I didn't respond, but his words made my skin crawl. The air in the car felt heavier, colder, like the storm had seeped inside. As we rounded a bend, the car's headlights caught something in the road ahead. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or a large dog. But as we got closer, I realized it was something else. A figure. It was standing in the middle of the road, its back turned to us. It didn't move as the car approached, and I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the icy pavement. The car stopped just a few feet away. "What the hell?" I muttered, leaning forward to get a better look. The figure turned slowly. It was a man, but something about him wasn't right. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and empty. He stared at us, unblinking, his head tilted slightly to one side. "Keep driving," the hitchhiker said, his voice suddenly sharp. I hesitated, my hands gripping the wheel. The figure in the road didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there watching us. "Go!" the hitchhiker snapped, his voice rising. "Don't stop." I pressed the gas, swerving around the figure. As we passed, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was still standing there, his hollow eyes fixed on the car. But there was something else. A second figure emerging from the trees, then a third, their pale faces barely visible through the storm. My heart was racing as I sped down the road, the snow blurring everything around us. The hitchhiker was silent now, staring straight ahead, his hands gripping his backpack tightly. I wanted to ask him what the hell was going on, but the words caught in my throat. After a few miles, the road split into two forks. The GPS was useless in the storm, and I couldn't tell which way to go. The hitchhiker pointed to the left. "That way," he said. "Are you sure?" I asked. He didn't answer, just nodded. I took the left fork, the road narrowing as it wound through the forest. The snow was falling harder than ever, and the headlights barely lit the way ahead. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches heavy with ice. Then the car sputtered. "No, no, no," I muttered, gripping the wheel as the engine coughed and died. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The only sound was the wind howling outside. "Stay here," the hitchhiker said suddenly. He opened the door and stepped out into the storm. "Wait," I shouted, but he was already gone, disappearing into the snow. I sat there, alone in the dark, my breath fogging up the windows. The storm seemed louder now, the wind battering the car like it wanted to rip it apart. Minutes passed, then what felt like hours. The hitchhiker didn't come back. I was about to get out and look for him when I heard it. A soft tapping on the window. I froze, my heart pounding. The tapping came again, louder this time. Slowly, I turned to look. A face was pressed against the glass. It was pale and hollow, with empty eyes and a mouth twisted into a crooked grin. Behind it, more faces appeared, their gaunt features illuminated by the faint light of the snow. They surrounded the car, their hands pressing against the windows, their fingers leaving streaks of frost. I screamed, fumbling with the keys, but the car wouldn't start. The faces grew closer, their hollow eyes staring into mine, their mouths moving soundlessly. Then I heard the door creak open. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital. A plow driver had found my car abandoned on the side of the road, the doors open and snow piled inside. There was no sign of the hitchhiker or the figures in the storm. I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. They said I must have imagined it, that the storm had gotten to me. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I see a figure on the side of the road, hitchhiking in the snow. It was the evening after Christmas in 2018, and I had just gotten off my shift at the local pizza place. The weather was freezing, and the snow was falling lightly outside, coating everything in a blanket of white. It was supposed to be a quiet night. Most people would be at home, spending time with family, enjoying the aftermath of the holidays. But not at the pizza shop. No, it was busier than ever, with last-minute orders and desperate delivery requests. I had signed up for extra shifts to make some holiday money, and it was around 8 p.m. when my manager asked me to start making deliveries. I grabbed the first pizza, a single order for a house about 20 minutes away. The roads were nearly empty, and as I drove, the snow seemed to swallow the world around me. It was peaceful, almost serene, driving through the quiet streets as the flakes gently fell under the streetlights. I was taking my time, enjoying the solitude, knowing that when I returned, there'd be more chaos waiting at the shop. After about 15 minutes of driving, I turned onto a gravel road that led to a house off the main highway. It was tucked away in the woods, with tall trees surrounding it. The driveway was long and barely plowed, but I managed to park and grab the pizza. The house itself was decorated to the nines for Christmas. Twinkling lights hung from every window, and large inflatables dotted the yard. It looked festive and cozy, but something felt off. The lights outside were on, but the house was dark inside, which I found odd. I walked up the porch steps and noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the snow, leading up to the front door. But they didn't stop at the door. They veered off to the side, heading around the corner of the house. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as nothing. Maybe someone had gone out back or was doing something in the yard. I knocked on the door. No answer. I waited for a few seconds, then knocked again. Still nothing. It was quiet, eerily so, except for the soft wind and the occasional creak of snow underfoot. I knocked a third time, louder this time, feeling frustrated. I checked the receipt to make sure I had the right address, then knocked again. But no one answered. The silence was unnerving. I thought maybe the owners had gone out for a walk or were upstairs. I wasn't about to let a pizza get cold, so I decided to leave it by the door and head back to my car. But as I turned, I noticed a man standing at the edge of the porch. He was bundled up in a thick jacket, snow pants, boots, Everything you'd expect in a storm like this. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me. "Hey, did you order this pizza?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly as I tried to ignore the strange feeling gnawing at me. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly started walking toward me, his movements stiff. There was something off about the way he moved. He didn't hurry, didn't act like someone who was cold and desperate to get inside. His pace was slow, methodical, like he already knew I wasn't going anywhere. Suddenly, panic surged through me. My car was parked at the end of the long driveway, and I was standing alone with this man who didn't speak a word. I turned to go back to the car, my hands fumbling as I tried to open the door. I jumped in, locking the doors quickly. My heart was racing, my breath fogging up the windows. I started the car, praying it would start. It sputtered but didn't turn over. I tried again, nothing. The engine stalled, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I cursed under my breath as I tried one more time, turning the key desperately. The engine turned over, but the man was now standing at the front of my car, blocking my view of the road. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911. As I waited for the dispatcher to answer, I watched him move closer to my window. He didn't run or shout. He just walked, his face expressionless. When I finally heard the dispatcher's voice on the phone, I explained my situation and told her where I was. The man had come closer now, and as I tried to start the engine again, I could hear his voice through the phone. It was deep, gravelly. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I hadn't told him I was calling anyone, so how did he know? I tried to keep my voice steady, telling the dispatcher I needed help and giving her my location. As I kept the phone pressed to my ear, I noticed the man had backed away slightly. He started reaching into his jacket, pulling something out. I couldn't see what it was, but panic set in when I saw the desperation in his movements. He began to walk toward the side of the house, his movements quickening. I had no idea if he was coming back or getting something. My mind was racing. The seconds felt like hours. Then, I saw the flashing blue and red lights in the rearview mirror. The man noticed them too. Without a second thought, he bolted, disappearing into the snow-covered trees. When the police arrived, they questioned me about the situation, but they never found the man. The house was empty. The owners had gone to visit family for the holidays, and there was no record of anyone living there recently. They even checked the house's decorations. It turned out that the man had plugged in all the outdoor lights, making it look like someone was home when they weren't. The whole thing still doesn't sit right with me. That man was out there waiting, and the only reason I'm here today is because I happened to get lucky. I stopped doing deliveries after that night, and I never want to think about what could have happened if the police hadn't arrived when they did.